Have you ever stopped to think about where our whole idea of romantic love actually comes from? You know, the falling head over heels, the pining, the grand gestures. We kind of take it for granted like it's always been a part of being human, but it hasn't. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the medieval poets who pretty much invented it, the troubadours.
Right, so let's just ask the big question straight up. Where did all this come from? Because if you look back, way back before the Middle Ages, love was seen really differently. Marriage? That was mostly about land, alliances, money, not so much about passion. So who was it that flipped the script? Who decided that love, this intense, personal, often painful feeling, was something worth writing about, singing about, and turning into high art?
Now, most of us, when we think about this, we have a kind of fairy tale version that pops into our heads. You know the one I'm talking about. It's a world of knights in shining armor, beautiful and mysterious ladies, and right at the heart of it all is one of the most famous and powerful women of the entire medieval period.
This whole scene probably feels super familiar, right? The story goes that back in 12th century France, the one and only Eleanor of Aquitaine held these things called courts of love at her palace in Poitiers. Knights would show up with their romantic dilemmas, their relationship problems, and Eleanor and her ladies-in-waiting would act as judges, handing down the final verdict on matters of the heart. In this world, a knight had to go out and prove himself with epic deeds, all for the love of his lady. It was supposed to be a real-life Camelot.
It's a great story, isn't it? I mean, it's the perfect romantic origin for romantic love. But what if I told you that this beautiful, chivalrous picture is, well, mostly just a story? Let's start to pull on a few threads of this legend, because the real story is honestly way more interesting.
Okay, so here's the twist. Those famous courts of love, they probably never actually happened. As the historian Alison Weir puts it, they were likely no more than a literary conceit. Just a really cool idea for a story, a clever plot device, but not something that actually took place in a courtroom.
So if they didn't happen, where do we even get this idea? Well, it all seems to come from one single source, a book from the 12th century called De Amore, which means about love, by a guy named Andreas Capellanus. He's the one who wrote down all the rules and described these courts, even naming Eleanor as the head judge. But here's the catch. He wrote the book after Eleanor had already packed up and left that part of France. And what's more, there are 0 other accounts from that time that back him up. None.
And this is a real mindbender. The term we all use to describe this, courtly love, nobody in the Middle Ages ever said that. That phrase was actually invented much, much later in 1883 by a French scholar. So for more than 100 years, we've been looking at this whole medieval movement through a very modern Victorian-era lens.
All right, so if the fairy tale is out, what's the real deal? Let's forget the myth and talk about who the troubadours really were. Because what they actually did was, in a lot of ways, even more revolutionary than the legend.
So this whole movement really gets its start in the late 11th century. The guy often called the first troubadour was William IX of Aquitaine, who, by the way, was Eleanor's grandfather. The whole thing really hits its stride, its golden age, around 1150. You've got poets like Bernart de Ventadorn, who was basically a medieval rock star known as the master singer. All in all, this tradition burned brightly for about a century and a half before things started to wind down.
Okay, let's just make sure we've got the vocabulary down, because it's important. A troubadour was a male poet and composer from what is now southern France, writing in the local language of Occitania. But, and this part often gets forgotten, there were also women doing this. They were called the troubadours. And the only reason we know any of their work today is because of these beautiful hand-copied manuscripts called chansonniers, which literally just means songbooks.
So, why are we even talking about them? What was so revolutionary? Well, for starters, they were the first major poets in Europe to stop writing in Latin, the official language of church and state, and start using the language people actually spoke every day. That was huge. It democratized poetry. They're the ones who made themes like chivalry and this new idea of romantic love popular. Plus, they were total nerds about poetry, inventing super complex forms. Their style was so influential it spread like wildfire across Europe, setting the stage for some of the greatest poets in history. But it wasn't all just one big, happy group of poets singing the same tune. The world of the troubadours was a buzzing, complicated place full of competing ideas, and nowhere was that more obvious than in how they talked about love.
On one hand, you had the classic male troubadour. Let's take our master singer, Bernart de Ventadorn. In his songs, the woman he loves is often portrayed as a divine agent. She's not quite human. She's this perfect, pure, goddess-like figure on a pedestal, totally out of reach. This was the ideal they called fin amours, or fine love.
But then,
Then you listen to the troubadours, the women, and you get a completely different story. Just listen to this line from the Countess of Dia. "Now I see I've been betrayed because I wouldn't sleep with him." Wow. I mean, that is not a goddess on a pedestal. That's raw, it's real, it's brutally honest. It's the voice of an actual woman dealing with the messy, frustrating reality of a relationship.
And you know, there was another massive competitor for people's hearts and minds at the time: the church. At the very same moment the troubadours were singing about this earthly, complicated love, the church was pushing devotion to the Virgin Mary. Think about it. The courtly lady was distant, maybe even cruel. But Mary, she was merciful and approachable. Love for a lady was a game, a conquest, that could totally mess with your head. But love for Mary, that promised eternal salvation. These were two powerful, competing visions of what love should be.
So what happened to this incredible culture? How did it all end? And maybe more importantly, what did it leave behind? Well, its legacy isn't just in old books. It's everywhere. It's woven into the very DNA of Western culture, and you can hear it every single day.
The end of the troubadours' worlds is actually pretty tragic. The vibrant, unique culture of southern France that let them flourish was basically wiped off the map. In the early 13th century, a brutal religious war called the Albigensian Crusade was launched in the region. Decades of violence destroyed the wealthy courts that had been the troubadours' patrons, scattering the poets and effectively silencing their world.
But here's the thing. You can destroy a place, but you can't kill an idea. And the troubadours' ideas created this incredible chain of influence that stretches all the way to us. So it starts with them, in southern France. Their style gets picked up by poets in the north, the Troubadours. From there it travels to Italy and directly inspires the giants of the Renaissance, poets like Dante and Petrarch. And that line, it leads straight to the songwriters of today who are still writing about the exact same things: love, longing, and of course, heartbreak.
So the next time you're listening to the radio or your favorite playlist and a love song comes on, I want you to really listen. Listen for the passion, the idealization of the person, the pain of wanting someone you can't have. What you're hearing is an echo, a nearly 900-year-old echo of a poet in a castle in France singing his heart out. The instruments are different, the language has changed, but the feeling is exactly the same. So the real question is, can you hear them?